Okay, let me do presenter view, blah, blah, blah. Bring the call back here. Okay. That's good enough. All right. So if you're not familiar, these are Street Fighter characters. I got inspired. As you'll see, it is relevant to the presentation. I promise. So it's Cammy on the left from Street Fighters 2 and then M. Bison. I played a lot of Street Fighters 2 growing up, so I'm very excited for this. Okay, cool. So we're going to be talking about asking for feedback versus asking for approval. And so the kind of problem or like issues that can arise with this is when expectations are mismatched about when feedback is appropriate versus approval. And a lot of times that misunderstanding can come from the client. They may not understand or fully comprehend the amount of revisions we have for something, or like, you know, for them, something that's critical to launch is not actually critical to launch. So kind of the big issue is miscommunication about what's appropriate. And this can create a lot of issues with things like, you know, budget, lots of extra work for people, timeline strain, and then it can make everybody frustrated. So we're going to talk about feedback mode versus approval mode. So in feedback mode, the goal of this is to correct and improve the asset. It's not necessarily to move on to the next step or finalize anything. The expectation that we want to set with the client is that feedback is going to be collected. You want to have a specific time frame. You also want to have a clear ask about what needs feedback. It can be helpful even in retainers to set an explicit number of revision rounds. I know we generally do 2. That may not work for every client, but still having that very explicit, like, we're going to do this in 3 rounds of revisions. We're going to do this in 1 round of revisions. This is all we have budgeted. That can be really helpful for the client, and also repeatedly saying that so that they're familiar, they can get that expectation kind of set in their head. So what's appropriate in feedback mode? Changes to what's been created within reason. Kind of good to double check, is it an actual legitimate edit, or is this like a fundamental change to the feature, which that's a little bit of scope creep, and we'll talk about that. We also want to catch errors, so something is misspelled, the wrong color was used, etc. What this should look like, so you want to have things that are clearly labeled draft, even in your email. Hi, we have the first draft of this ready for review, or we have the second draft. You may have multiple options or concepts depending on what you're presenting to the client, and then you can definitely include open questions here. And then moving into, this might be a short presentation, I don't know. Approval mode. So the goal of approval mode is approval with the intent of moving to the next step. So this is the last thing that we need to do before we move to the next step, whether that be launch, development, whatever. So the expectation that's set here that we want to set with the client, there's explicit approval that is needed. This is the end of the phase. This is the last thing we're doing before we move on. So what's appropriate? That's error checking. Again, maybe there's a misspelled word that somebody didn't quite catch. Double check and make sure that's not there. We're also looking for confirmation. And we're also looking for, the client can ask questions about functionality or how this impacts the next phase, but we're not looking for open-ended questions. So what that should look like, we want a final draft. There's no alternatives or options, no open questions, more yes or no kind of questions. Don't give the client room to ask those open-ended questions. So with those, feedback mode and approval mode, it's important to set boundaries about what that looks like. So at the start of the project or any new phase, it can be helpful to kind of outline like what that process will look like. Like I could be, you know, I don't do site builds, so this could be a weird example, but you know, we'll create a style tile and provide it to you for feedback with 2 rounds of revisions. You know, that's a good place to gauge the client's reaction, or even flat out just straight up ask, like, does that work for you? Because the goal that we want to set here is shared expectations around what feedback what feedback looks like when it's appropriate, and if this is necessarily the best process for the client. And I say that because I've had clients in the past where I know that 2 rounds of revision is not going to work, AKA Avalon. I love Avalon, but sometimes they have to do some internal reviews before they pass it along to the client, and the client themselves may want 2 rounds of revisions. And we talked about that up front. So we laid out 3 rounds of revisions for the client and made sure the budgeted hours that we had worked with that. So some of the boundaries we're setting around feedback. So we want to set boundaries about specifically what we're asking for feedback on. We want to set a clear number of revision rounds. We also want to make sure we push back against scope creep as soon as we can, because I know that's hard. It can, scope creep. It's not scope hit you in the face sometimes. We want to make sure it can sneak in, and we want to try and stop it before it gets too big. And then, like I said, if you're familiar with the client, kind of tailor feedback to what works best for them. Another example, can the client handle placeholders, or do they need real example content? Some clients cannot get past placeholders. It trips them up, and that's all they get focused on, and then we end up wasting a round of revisions. So for those folks, sometimes it's better to have actual example content from the client that you will put on the page or in the email, and then they can actually conceptualize what it's going to look like. Which leads us to clear communication is a key fundamental aspect of asking for feedback versus asking for approval. And I guess the reason why I may be doing this presentation is because I am constantly asking for feedback and approval on like 5, 10, 20 emails every week, month, whatever. Also SEO, also, we all are always asking for feedback, but I know I'm always doing that with my email clients, especially. So clear communication is really important. The words we use are really important. We want to use clear language around what we're asking for. So feedback language can include things like, please provide feedback on item. And at this stage, we're reviewing layout, not final colors or images. So kind of corralling the client to be like, okay, that's nice, but this is what we're talking about right now. Approval language is more concrete, yes or no. Is this approved to launch? We're looking for a yes or no on moving forward with X. And then, kind of indicating like what happens next. So if approved, we'll move forward with next step. Some red flag language for us when asking for feedback or approval is, please let me know your thoughts, or let us know what you think. And I'm guilty of doing that too, especially in retainers where there's not necessarily, I haven't set that clear boundary. I'll send a page and be like, let me know your thoughts. Let me know if you have any edits. Probably not the best way to do that, because that can lead to things like a feedback drip, which I'll talk about later. But the biggest thing here is being specific. It's really important to be as specific as possible. So an example, please provide the first round of revisions on this email copy by date. So the specific round was named. The specific item that needs feedback is listed with a specific date. So that way also we can always look back to that and have that paper trail of like when we asked for revisions and how things generally pan out with the client. If they're always late, then that's something we can use to figure out, hey, this is the client that maybe needs 10 days for a review instead of 5. Okay, yeah, this is going to be a very short presentation, but we can talk about it later. All right, so some roadblocks and resolutions. So there's a lot of roadblocks that can pop up with asking for feedback or approval. And I've created some like outlines of what those things are, and then some examples of how we can respond to those. So potential roadblocks, a big one is when expectations weren't met. That's a really good place to pause and say, before moving to the next round of revisions, it might be helpful to like regroup and kind of restart. And that usually includes a conversation with the client to figure out why the expectations weren't met and how to diagnose it from there. The feedback drip, which is super fun. I know it probably happens in site builds. I know it also happens a lot in retainers where there's no set end to the project. It's just, you know, somebody might pop up a month later and be like, hey, remember that thing we worked on? Yeah, I have more feedback on it. Yeah. So this is like I said, constant feedback after the feedback period has ended. This is a good place to kind of call out and regroup, you know, notice calling out to the client, hey, I noticed you're giving me a lot of feedback on this. You know, we should probably pause and come back to revisions. This can be also, like I said, difficult to stop in retainers where there's no end date to the project. Yeah. Thanks, Chelsea. So another really fun one that I think we've all experienced a lot is when feedback is given, when approval is asked for. This can kind of maybe fall into expectations weren't met, but not always. So this is a good place to kind of pause and say, hey, is this like something that's actually needed before launch? And then also kind of talking about the implications of extending that feedback round. And then something that is probably that's probably happened a lot is also the misunderstanding of scope creep. A client may not necessarily realize they're creeping on the scope a little bit. They may not necessarily recognize the effort level behind what they think is just an edit. So that edit may actually just maybe a brand new feature or like a complete fundamental change to how a page functions. And that's a good place to call out and say, hey, not exactly what we're looking for right now, but we can talk about that in the next iteration, things like that. So with those potential roadblocks, here are some resolutions. I'm saving not meeting expectations for the next slide. That's going to be a bigger conversation. So some things we can say when we have the feedback drip. Thanks for flagging these. To make sure we address everything efficiently, please send over any remaining feedback in one message. Once we have everything, we'll review next steps. So acknowledging the client has more feedback, calling out like, hey, this constant drip of feedback is not necessarily working. Please include everything in one message, and then we can kind of talk about how to move on from there. Also saying we want to review this holistically rather than in fragments. And then looking at when feedback is given, when approval is asked for, good place where you can say, yes, we can add another round of revisions, but it will affect our timeline. So saying, yes, that is something we can do, but this is the implications it's going to have. Also saying this is past the feedback stage, but we can log this as a future enhancement. We're happy to note that for future iterations, but for now, we're looking to confirm approval. I see a question from B. What is your advice for when they're going backwards with their feedback drip, like something that's already been approved? I think going back to that saying, hey, you know, if they're saying like this is no longer approved, saying, okay, that's good to know. We need to talk about that and kind of regroup. That is somewhere where you might want to see if expectations maybe weren't met, or maybe there's been a change in expectations, especially I know a lot of our clients are dealing with higher ups or boards that I know this just happened with our lovely friends at Huffles. They're redesigning their site with another firm, and they had a new design, and the board completely nuked it. So they thought they were ready to move forward with the next step, and the board said absolutely not. So this is a good place where you want to check with the client, like it may not necessarily be them that is causing the feedback reversal or approval reversal. So it may be good to check with them about why, and then resetting expectations around like, okay, so we have not budgeted for this. So either you may need to approve additional hours, or say like, we have a few extra hours here that we can use to work with that, but we can only do one round of revision. So kind of just pause, reevaluate. So looking at scope creep, you know, mentioning to the client like, hey, yeah, we can explore that, but it would require additional development. Do you want us to scope it? Yes or no question, not a, you know, we can look in, you know, obviously you can start with, we can look into this, but basically saying, you know, that's great, we can scope that. That's not part of the original scope that we have. Also saying we're at approval now, and additional changes would require revisiting the scope. Okay. Oh no. There we And then roadblock resolutions for missed expectations, because this can kind of be a bigger process. And I kind of like to think of it as a three-part process. So in the first step, we're going to acknowledge to the client, like, hey, thank you for your candid feedback. It sounds like this isn't what you were expecting, or that's helpful context. Let's pause and realign before we move forward. And then in the diagnose stage, that's going to be more open-ended questions. You can ask things like, hey, which parts feel furthest from what you had in mind, or what were you hoping this would feel like? And then in the reset stage, that's where we want to set really clear expectations around, once we align on this new direction, we can confirm next steps and impact. And then this feedback points to a directional shift rather than refinements. Kind of talk about what that looks like from there. So that's, acknowledge, diagnose, reset. All right, let's hope this works. Hopefully the sound works. So now we're going to move. Yeah, is it playing? You're not. No. Okay, that's a bummer. Well, okay, hopefully it's the player select music for Street Fighter 2. Yeah, it's a little YouTube video there, but, so here we are going to select our player. So we're going to choose our fighter. This is kind of just a little bit of a summary. So before you hit send on anything, you want to choose your mode. So yeah, Bison. So feedback mode, we're open to edits and changes. We're exploring options and directions, more open-ended discussion. Approval mode is concrete decisions, yes, no questions. And last step, it's the last step of the current phase. So if you're not explicit, you'll be put into feedback mode by default, creating the potential for an infinite feedback loop. So this is why it's really important to be very specific and explicit. And then I guess you may not hear this, but you'll see it. There you go. Okay.
Was he asking for approval?
That was just the presentation's over, knockout, we win, everybody wins. It was a perfect score.
It was a knockout, yes.
So yeah, I think this is a good place if anybody has any questions or have any things they want, feedback on, or like want to chat about. This is I don't remember any heads being ripped off in Street Fighter, but I'm sure there's something like that. Yeah, Chelsea.
Yay. I just had a comment, which is a fun just learning experience for me with builds, is those moments of I actually don't want or need your approval or feedback, and figuring out, like, do I want or need this? How can I frame this so I can say, like, if we don't hear more from you, we're moving ahead on this state. That's been helpful to identify when we can do that on projects to move things forward faster. So I know Ira and I have talked a lot about how projects can be delayed because we are asking for feedback too much and we're getting stuck in this like extended trap. So yeah, that's all for me.
Yeah, Leah.
I have kind of a question thing to think over with kind of with the support team, I guess. So for instance, I have this mini project that we finished a month ago, and they're the kind of client that needs a lot of hand holding. And they still will reach out to me about certain things, even though I mentioned, passing on to support team, but then like some of the things are like I would need to go look up that information for the support team. It's kind of like a juggling act, like how much should I keep working on versus just completely sending the questions to the support team because they're to send it back to me. Like, I don't want to just dump it on the support team, but I know we don't have the budget for that anymore. So it's kind of a question of like, how do we handle that moving forward? I just had that happen this morning, so that's why it's on my mind. Jake.
Yeah,
cool. I mean, I don't want to over insert myself. I was just talking to someone about this and I forgot. Might have even been you, Leah. But just definitely feel free to position us like kind of good cop, bad cop, where it's like, hey, I don't know, we don't have any more time. Like our project is done, but the support team's there to help you out. So I'm asking them, and then just give us a heads up, and we can be the bad cops to say, hey, that's not going to be a 30-minute task. Like that's going to be something that we need to scope out. And like, you know, that way it's kind of off your plate. Like you've been as nice as you possibly can. Like, hey, we're done with that project. Support's there to help you. But, you know, knowing that maybe we're already going to run into some sort of limit, you know, you can just let us know like, hey, I'm sending this over to you. It's probably going to be bigger than just a quick, fast task, but if you all can handle it from there. And I think that's a good delineation if that works for you. But I love hearing feedback too. That's what I was thinking.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. Of position the support team as the experts of like, you know, we've finished this project and now I don't have that answer. So let's go talk to Jake and his team and he'll get you there. But also I think making sure though, because when we are seeing that, if that client coming back to us, like it almost speaks that Search WP example, why we're boosting our intranet posts and resources around that is that a lot of times we don't mention or we don't discuss it, and clients are feeling like after the fact, like, oh, now it's not working properly, so I have to come back to you. So kind of what Andy was talking about, it all comes back to kind of what did we do wrong, and that quick pause of like, are they asking a whole bunch of questions because we didn't answer them originally, or are they asking a bunch of questions because it's now a new phase and therefore needs to move to Jake? So again, I really want to emphasize that kind of pausing for a moment and thinking of the reasons of why are we getting these questions. It's not just because the client likes to be annoying. And what is their reason for getting it? Is this that the higher ups have now raised some issues? Is it that we didn't build things correctly? Kind of what is that expectation, or what's going on there that's causing these questions?
Yeah, I think one thing I just want to flag that I saw in the comments, B pointed out that this is kind of a PM heavy topic, but it's also a place where it's really helpful for devs and content specialists to call out, especially when there's scope creep. We may not necessarily recognize that there's scope creep right away. So it's important to be like, hey, that edit is actually a 10-hour task. So pause on that, go back to the client, maybe check with them on what's going on there. Yeah, that's especially where we could use your help, but also, I know y'all send stuff to us all the time. So, there's that feedback loop too. PMs can be too nice, but that's, that's where you can be assertive.
So I have a question, Andy, about you kind of mentioned, I'm in the same way of like that, kind of drip and sometimes enabling that poor client behavior and things like that. And so a lot of this is that mindset shift of, instead of saying, like I'm the type of person that will end every email of let me know what you think or something like that. And so like, how do you change your mindset to not be writing that at the end of every email and not falling into those bad patterns?
Yeah, I mean, I think I learned about that the hard way when I was working with a lot of email clients, because if I wasn't clear, then I wouldn't get feedback on time, and then things would be delayed, or, you get that constant feedback drip. So it became really important for me to set very clear expectations about what exactly I'm asking for, when I need it, and what part of the process we're in. I think that can be really helpful just before you send anything for any revisions, reiterating to the client, we have 2 rounds of revisions. This is the first round. Please provide your feedback on this part specifically. As clear communication as you can leaves almost no room for interpretation, which is the goal. So I think, learn from my mistakes. Yeah,
I've got my hand raised. And I was just gonna kind of reiterate that, of like almost thinking of it like a formula of, okay, what am I asking for? Is it feedback or approval? What am I asking it on? Have I said how I want them to provide it? And have I provided a due date? Also just including things that you feel like are pleasantries, but you really don't care. Like, I don't really want you to tell me what you think. I just want you to do this, is more of like the, I think, crutch that sometimes we fall on because we think that makes it more friendly or approachable, but actually just creates confusion and can open the door for getting feedback that you actually don't need or want. So yeah, I think we all, when thinking of being assertive, I think, and Andy's talked about this before in their presentations, those, I think, pleasantries we associate with assertiveness, but are actually like doing you more of a disservice than anything.
And the one thing I always do, I've got like 5 Post-its on my screen here, and the one that I think everyone has is like, I often say yes too much. And so like having a Post-it that says no is still there. And just even those reminders of like when it's right in front of you are helpful. So that's at least one of my strategies. Yeah.
And also remembering that this is going to cause like a domino effect where if one thing gets delayed, that's going to just bunch of dominoes are going to fall and a lot of things are going to change. So doing your best to try and keep things like as much on time and focused as possible, because then you have that looming monster fear of like everything is changing and going wrong in the background, so that you can use that as motivation.
The only thing I was going to add is I feel like we do a really good job of this in our SEO and ads retainers of balancing between informing the client and asking for approval, because oftentimes we're just informing them about what we're doing. We send a weekly recap and a monthly email that is basically like, here's everything we did, where we're just moving full steam ahead because we are managing their SEO and ads and being very clear of when we need actual like approval and feedback to move forward. I had a good experience with this with Mabel, as we have a client where we're just kind of like whole hog managing their ads, but we needed to know, do they want us to spend time making updates on their website that they are fully capable of doing, or actually just letting them do that instead of us using that time. So that's really the only thing I needed feedback on them from. Everything else was just kind of letting them know what we were doing. And we didn't want feedback because we're owning and managing things. And with that update, they have the opportunity to review that and let me know if they have any concerns, but I'm not actively soliciting that.
Are there any other questions or comments from anybody? Thanks, Jake.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Andy. I think this was great and an important, very relevant topic. I forget who said it, but this is, even though this can seem like a PM heavy topic, this is relevant and important to everybody, not just with our client communication, but also how we do things internally. Of sometimes, you know, if you're a developer and you need a second set of, if you're asking for feedback on some of your code, or are you asking for, is this good enough? And so there's a lot that can be done and a lot that can be taken with this session. So thank you so much, Andy. I appreciate you boiling it down so concisely, and yeah, I think it's great. Well, everyone have a wonderful Monday, and we will talk to you soon.